So, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom has been out for less than a week. It is obviously blowing everyone's mind, and the whole world is captivated by this game, and as they should be, because it is freaking excellent. However, in less than a week, we've already gotten a little bit of an update and a glimpse into where Nintendo might be taking Zelda in the future after Tears of the Kingdom, which is very exciting information to hear, and I think that what is discussed might be surprising to some people, and it'll also be interesting to hear what's exciting to folks and what's maybe disappointing to folks. I know I have my own thoughts on what they discuss, and there are things I like and things I don't like, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's just nice to kind of hear that Nintendo is already thinking about what will come next. So essentially what we're talking about today is an interview that Eiji Aonuma was giving with Game Informer, discussing Tears of the Kingdom and the release and their approach to the game and where the future may go. And there's an interesting tidbit about how the introduction of Breath of the Wild and that approach to making an open world and that change to the traditional Zelda format is influencing the future of the franchise. Obviously, with Tears of the Kingdom being a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild, we knew that it was going to adopt that same kind of art style and that same approach to the open world design. Obviously, they've evolved it in an incredible way by adding the sky above and the depths below, but the overall feel and style of game, style of Zelda game that Tears of the Kingdom is very much completely in line with Breath of the Wild. And of course, that's without even touching on the story implications, because when you make a game that's a direct sequel to another game, 9 times out of 10, if not more, you're going to have a story that is related and is continuing that saga, right? We actually saw this way back in the day with Majora's Mask being a direct sequel to the Ocarina of Time, and that was the sequel in the young world of Link, where he went back at the end of Ocarina of Time to become the young version of himself, and it was that young Link that journeyed on to Termina, and then, of course, kicked off the inciting events and the story that was Majora's Mask. And Phantom Hourglass was a sequel to The Wind Waker, and again, we've seen direct sequels in Zelda 1 or 2 times before. A Link Between Worlds being a direct sequel to A Link to the Past, right? And so, of course, Tears of the Kingdom is going to do all of these things. Continue the story, continue the art style, and continue the approach to the open world design. However, in this interview, and I'm going to read some of these quotes here, Aonuma did discuss how the success of Breath of the Wild influenced not only Tears of the Kingdom, but for now, it's influencing the future design for future Zelda games. Game Informer asked him this. They say, "I think a lot of people share the viewpoint that Ocarina of Time was kind of the starting point for one era of Zelda games, laying the foundation for the several titles that came after it. Do you see Breath of the Wild as establishing the new blueprint or foundation of the next several Zelda games for years to come?" In response, Aonuma said this: "With Ocarina of Time, I think it's correct to say that it did kind of create a format for a number of titles in the franchise that came after it. But in some ways, that was a little bit restricting for us. While we always aimed to give the player freedoms of certain kinds, there were certain things that format didn't really afford in giving people freedom. Of course, the series continued to evolve after Ocarina of Time, but I think it's also fair to say now that we've arrived at Breath of the Wild and the new type of more open play and freedom that it affords. Yeah, I think it's correct to say that it has created a new kind of format for the series to proceed from." So boy oh boy is this interesting and fascinating, and for me as a longtime Zelda fan who goes back to the release of the original game on the NES, because yes, I am that old, I find this interesting because I am a fan of pretty much every iteration of the Zelda franchise, but yes, the 3D kind of linear style that was introduced with the Ocarina of Time is something very near and dear to my heart. I like the fact that we're following a little bit more of a set path, but still with huge open environments and an open world that you can kind of explore at your own will. You will find very simple side quests and NPCs to interact with. Of course, there's a couple of other very key elements that come with those older style of games that Ocarina of Time introduced, that of a companion character as well as traditional dungeons. Now, I've gone on record to say that even though I love and in many ways kind of prefer that traditional Zelda, or at least the traditional 3D Zelda format, I still think Breath of the Wild and now Tears of the Kingdom are incredible, mind-blowing games. Both of them are 10s out of 10s for me, okay? So just to put it in perspective, yes, I am a huge fan, as an old guy with nostalgia, of Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Skyward Sword, Twilight Princess, The Wind Waker being my all-time favorite Zelda game, right? So that classic style is near and dear to me, and I will always love it and probably prefer it. But again, in the same breath, I can still say Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the game-changing, foundation-laying Zelda games for the future, at least as of now, are still almost perfect titles. Again, I would give them both a 10 out of 10. I mean, I haven't finished Tears of the Kingdom. I'm only 10 or 15 hours into the game. I have a long way to go. But right now, it's definitely leaning towards a 10 out of 10 for me, right? So it is possible for both things to be true, and I think that I'm a good example of that. So again, we have to really consider the impact of what he's saying here, right? Going back to the comparison he made and that I was discussing, when the Ocarina of Time came out in 1998 on the Nintendo 64, the first time The Legend of Zelda ever went into 3D, when 3D gaming was still brand new, by the way. You have to remember that, especially if you're too young to have lived through it or experienced it in its natural, organic way. This was a new, exciting thing for any games to be moving into 3D, right? On the PlayStation, the Saturn, the Nintendo 64, and some other platforms out there trying to do 3D gaming. And so Mario was a massive success transitioning to 3D, and of course, Zelda was too with the Ocarina of Time. And again, that kind of linear but pseudo-open format that also contained traditional dungeons and contained companion characters was the foundation that the Ocarina of Time laid out. And again, these games I just listed, Majora's Mask, Skyward Sword, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, they all followed in that format. And obviously those of us that are Zelda fans know how Breath of the Wild changed this, right? The story and the progression through the world was no longer linear in any single way. Again, there were freedoms afforded to people in the older games, and I think that sometimes when folks discuss those older games and that older style, and we talk about how there was a linear story, people still forget that they weren't completely restrictive in that traditional sense. They're not like an Uncharted game, for example, where you literally only have one straight path through the game. You do have to do certain things in order in the older Zelda games, but you still have a huge open world and different sections of the Hyrule map or wherever you happen to be to explore at your own pace, and you will find side quests and you will do things in different orders outside of the main direct story and the main direct dungeons, right? You can only do the dungeons in certain orders in those games, right? That's the linearity of those games. Everything else around it, even going back to the Ocarina of Time, the first game to do this, still gave us a sense of freedom. But it also came with a little bit of restriction, right? So it's like, it's all true at the same time. Breath of the Wild said no more linear path in any way, shape, or form. The world was bigger than it's ever been. There was more to do and more to discover than ever before. And they did get rid of companions, right? And they did get rid of traditional dungeons, but instead, I think to build on to the huge openness and non-linearity of that style of Zelda game, they gave us 120 shrines that are small little mini puzzles and mini dungeons to explore and to solve throughout that game. And it wasn't requiring you to have certain items and certain new weapons at certain points in the game to move into the next phase of the game, right? Like the older ones did. That's what Breath of the Wild did. That changed everything. Not to mention the physics engine and the whole weapon system and all that stuff was also new. Tears of the Kingdom, same concept. It took exactly what Breath of the Wild did to change the formula and is now moving it into its next phase while still doing what the foundation of that game laid. And look, I don't want to ignore the fact that Tears of the Kingdom is only days old and there's still weeks and months and years for us to enjoy this game and discover its secrets for what it is. So I don't want to just like ignore it and immediately start moving on to the next thing and thinking about the future. But at the same time, that is kind of what we're doing. And in response to Aonuma's quotes, that's what we have to talk about, right? Where he said, the Ocarina of Time laid a foundation for many games. Breath of the Wild is now creating a new kind of format for the series for it to proceed from, right? That is exactly verbatim what he says in this quote. So he is confirming that the way of Breath of the Wild, for now, will probably be the future. So that just tells me that the next game that will follow Tears of the Kingdom, probably in another 4 to 5 or 6 years from now, and definitely will be on the Nintendo Switch 2, or whatever the next gen console is going to be, is going to further be this style of game. It is going to be a big, massive open world and an open map, and it is going to have a very non-linear path and non-linear approach to the story. I'm sure of it, because that's exactly what Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom did, they rely on you finding little story bits in any order that you happen to stumble upon them throughout the game worlds, right? And I think that the next probably several Zelda games, according to what Aonuma is saying here, will adopt this same approach. And here's the thing. Is there a part of me that's disappointed? Yes, because I would love to see the modern Nintendo with more capable hardware at their disposal kind of recreate the classic Zelda format. Give us different versions of Link with different companions and make new crazy dungeons and new game worlds. Yes, I would love to see that. But at the same time, when I think about them taking the current Breath of the Wild format and going even farther beyond that, I can't help but get insanely excited. And the main reason is, and I think this is something other people aren't thinking about right now, is the fact that, in theory, the future Zelda games that are now building off of the Breath of the Wild foundation will start to also look and be very different than what Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are. Remember, you guys, the classic way that Nintendo makes Zelda games isn't to stick with one style and one art style and one version of Link and Zelda and Ganon or whatever, and just repeat that over and over again. Even though Phantom Hourglass and Majora's Mask are like visually, similar to the games that preceded it in terms of like being sequels, in general, Nintendo changes up and refreshes the look of the main characters, Link and Zelda, and the look and the layout of the worlds themselves. Think about it. Link and Zelda are different in Ocarina of Time and The Wind Waker and Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword. And the versions of Hyrule or the areas that you're exploring, the maps you're in, are also different in all of those games. Now, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are direct sequels, so the art style and the layouts of the Hyrule map are the same. But again, in theory, if the next game after Tears of the Kingdom is going to be another kind of reset of Zelda, even though it's going to use the same non-linear approach and huge open world, in theory, everyone is going to look different. Link and Zelda will be redesigned as different versions of themselves with more powerful hardware, and the world of Hyrule, or whatever world they take us to, will also be extremely different from the current version of Hyrule that we're playing in right now. To me, that is insanely exciting. To wrap this up, I'm going to go back to Majora's Mask one more time as a comparison. Majora's Mask, direct sequel to the Ocarina of Time, using the same art style and the same art design and the same character model of Link, right? Obviously, it looked better and it used the expansion pack, so the quality of visuals and graphics was better, but it was the same art style and the same kind of version of Link, just slightly better looking because of the expansion pack. But they did not stay in that game's version of Hyrule. They went to a totally new area called Termina. That's layout was different and everything about it was just different because it was no longer Hyrule. So in theory, we can go to a different world in the next Zelda game after Tears of the Kingdom. If they don't decide to make a third sequel, if they decide to freshen it up, it could just be Hyrule but different. The same way, I don't know, Hyrule in Twilight Princess is different from Hyrule in the Ocarina of Time, right? But I also think there's a chance that they take us to some totally new, far-off land. It's not going to be called Hyrule. Maybe the story will discuss Hyrule as something from the past or whatever. But I think it might be a different Link, a different Zelda, and in a different world. And imagine a completely different art style than this kind of cel-shaded art style that the Breath of the Wild games are using. It's incredibly exciting, again, especially if you think about it being on a Switch 2 in 5 or 6 years. They could go in so many different ways, but again, it's going to be the foundational gameplay and approach that Breath of the Wild introduced, but in a different world, in a different map, with a different art style, and a different version of Link and Zelda. So, even though I'm somebody who's sad to be losing the more traditional 3D Zelda format, it also gets me very excited, because, as I said, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, incredible masterpieces to me. So if you want to make that the future foundation for your Zelda games for years to come, I'm all in, man, especially if they change it up. I don't really want a third sequel. I don't want another game that's identical to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I want the refresh, but using this new foundation the way he says. So anyway, a lot for me to say here because it's a big idea and it's exciting to hear them talk about this. I still have 100 hours to go in Tears of the Kingdom, but hearing him say this and thinking about the future of Zelda using this foundation, to me, it's incredibly exciting.